The Acolyte is a show that I thought I would hate. There's such a polarizing response to this show, with most saying that's the worst show that has ever been made, or even worse, possible Star Wars slop. But it's actually really unique and does some really rad things, and even though it falls on its face a lot more than you would expect for a show that has this much money behind it, with how many interesting and unique ideas it is presenting overall, it's kind of easy for me to overlook those and trying to see what the show is trying to do. This is the closest thing to come out of Disney Star Wars that feels like the prequels. It has unique and incredible additions to the Star Wars canon, while also fundamentally struggling at points to sustain a narrative that is cohesive and satisfying on its own merits. The Acolyte at its core is a murder mystery about a Jedi killer who's being tracked down by Master Soul and his lost pupil Osha. But the show never actually leans into the strengths of that genre. Instead of playing up the mystery of a possible re-emergence of the Sith, it decides to focus on not only the mystery of what is happening, but the killer side of the story as well. This bizarre way to structure the show ruins the tension of the early episodes, as there really isn't that much for our characters to investigate since the audience already has all the answers. And it leads to this bizarre 180 of the Acolyte, because for the first half of the show we're absolutely bored, but once our characters actually learn what's happening by episode 5, we end up completely locking in because we are so invested in these interesting characters. I have never seen a show lock in this much, because the last half of the show is so much better than the first half, you wouldn't even believe it. And why is that? Well, it's because of the interesting characters. The idea of a Sith emerging and not being evil for the sake of it, but viewing it as freedom from the bonds of the Jedi's rules is so interesting. This also goes along for our main characters. At first it seems like a horrible and pointless idea to have twin characters that are the same person, but it ends up paying off as they become this interesting double-sided coin of choice, and we see how the fate of the Force and the sides between light and dark are a lot more interchangeable than we think. And then we have Master Soul. He's probably my favorite character, and I think he's so interesting because he's so kind and supportive, but that is through his consistent bending and disregard of the Jedi rules. All of this intrigue and character depth though takes time to persist and to build, and I think it's a thing a lot of people won't see, because by the time we know and care about all these characters, half the show is already over. And that is due to the show's biggest flaw. The show doesn't hook you. This is a show about a Sith emerging out of hiding to gain pupils to slay Jedi at a time before Palpatine, and yet that concept is so boring. There's no interesting kills, there's a lack of progress, and some pretty stiff and rough acting right off the bat, and it's not going to make people stick with the show. Look how little sauce this first fight scene has in episode 1, and then episode 5, boom baby, that's what I'm talking about. That should have been there from the start. This is amazing. The Acolyte is a show that is not going to grab people like my mom right off the bat. Right now she still calls it the Star Wars show with the Squid Game guy in it. And that's kind of a shame, because the show does a lot more than a lot of the other Star Wars shows we get recently. Now I'm not saying the Acolyte doesn't have a few lame character references that will trigger grown men.
That is not plaguing.
But it does a lot of cool original stuff. Laser whips, Force witch cults, genuinely amazing lightsaber fights with new powers that are thrown in, and interesting looks at why the Sith were able to rise to power, and a story that when it ends is actually catching fire and is extremely cool with a knockout ending. And all that awesome cool stuff is in the back half of the show, and it's really a shame that not a lot of people are gonna see it. This is a show that is extremely flawed, but when it's at its best, it really cooks and is one of the coolest and freshest looks in a Star Wars, and I hope that with a hopeful next season that they are able to just hit the ground running and build off the great world and characters and style they had by the end of the show. The Acolyte at its best is really rad for 4 solid episodes and kind of a complete snooze fest for the other 4. And in that sense, season 1 of this show is a perfect 5 out of 10 for me. Yeah, this show's a fascinating mess, but deep down though, I think this show does at points go pretty hard. Also, this show has Ki-Adi-Mundi. How can it be a bad show? Get out of here.